Tonight's story takes us to the early 1960s, inside a quiet laboratory at Yale University, where a series of psychological experiments would raise questions that still echo decades later. The setting was calm and controlled, designed to appear ordinary, almost clinical. Volunteers arrived expecting to participate in a study about learning and memory. Instead, they would find themselves placed in situations that challenged their sense of responsibility, authority, and personal conscience in ways few could have anticipated. The experiments, later known as the Milgram Obedience Studies, were conducted during a period when psychologists were trying to better understand human behavior. In the context of authority and social influence, the world was still processing the aftermath of the Second World War, and questions about how ordinary individuals could participate in harmful actions under instruction had become deeply relevant. Researchers sought insight into whether obedience to authority might explain aspects of human behavior that seemed difficult to comprehend. Participants in the study were everyday people from a wide range of backgrounds. They were not selected because of unusual characteristics, but because they represented ordinary members of society. This element would later become one of the most striking aspects of the research. The findings suggested that behavior under authority might differ significantly from what individuals believed they would do when imagining such situations in advance. Over time, the Milgram experiments became one of the most discussed and debated studies in psychology. They influenced academic thinking, ethical standards, and public understanding of obedience and responsibility. Supporters argued that the research revealed important truths about human behavior, while critics raised serious concerns about the emotional impact on participants and the methods used. The conversation surrounding the study continues, even today, reflecting its lasting significance. As you settle in, allow the atmosphere to become calm and steady. This is not a story told with urgency, but with quiet attention to the events, the environment, and the questions that emerged. We will move gently through the context and details, observing how ordinary individuals responded within a carefully structured situation. Some insights about human behavior remain complex and open to interpretation, and tonight we simply explore them as the night continues. The early 1960s in the United States were marked by rapid social change, scientific advancement, and growing interest in understanding human behavior. Universities expanded research programs, and psychology was emerging as a field with increasing public visibility. Researchers sought to explore not only mental health and cognition, but also social influence, group behavior, and decision-making. This period created an environment where experiments involving human participants were becoming more common within academic institutions. The historical context also shaped research priorities. Only 2 decades had passed since the end of the Second World War, and societies around the world were still reflecting on the actions of individuals during that period. Questions about obedience, responsibility, and authority had entered both public discussion and academic inquiry. Psychologists wondered whether behavior observed in extreme historical events could be better understood through controlled scientific studies. These questions did not exist in isolation. They were connected to broader concerns about conformity, leadership, and the power of social structures. At the same time, research ethics were not yet governed by the formal standards that would develop later. Institutional review boards, participant protections, and detailed consent procedures were still evolving concepts. Many experiments relied on trust between researchers and volunteers, with limited oversight compared to modern expectations. While most researchers aimed to conduct studies responsibly, the boundaries of acceptable practice were still being defined. This environment allowed for experimentation that might later be viewed differently through contemporary ethical frameworks. Universities such as Yale provided resources, facilities, and academic credibility that supported ambitious research projects. Laboratories were designed to appear professional and authoritative, reinforcing the legitimacy of the experiments conducted within them. Participants often trusted researchers associated with respected institutions, believing that studies would be safe and meaningful. This trust became an important element in experiments examining authority, because institutional reputation itself could influence participant behavior. Psychological research culture during this era also emphasized observable behavior rather than internal experience alone. Researchers focused on how individuals acted within specific situations, believing that behavior could reveal underlying principles about human nature. Controlled environments allowed scientists to manipulate variables and observe responses, producing data that could be analyzed systematically. The goal was to move psychology toward a more empirical and measurable science. Media interest in psychology was growing as well. Articles, books, and public discussions introduced psychological concepts to wider audiences, increasing curiosity about human behavior. Experiments that produced surprising or thought-provoking results often attracted attention beyond academic circles. This intersection between science and public interest contributed to the impact certain studies would later have when their findings became widely known. Within this research culture, social psychology emerged as a particularly active area of study. Researchers explored how individuals responded to group pressure, authority figures, and social expectations. Earlier experiments on conformity had already demonstrated that people sometimes adjusted their behavior to align with group norms, even when those norms conflicted with personal judgment. These findings encouraged further investigation into how authority might influence behavior in more complex situations. Funding and institutional support also played a role in shaping research directions. Academic institutions encouraged innovative studies that could contribute to knowledge and reputation. Researchers competed for recognition, publications, and academic advancement, which sometimes motivated ambitious experimental designs. The combination of intellectual curiosity and institutional encouragement created conditions where significant studies could emerge. Public trust in science during this period was generally strong. Technological achievements and medical advances reinforced the belief that scientific research benefited society. Volunteers participating in experiments often felt they were contributing to meaningful knowledge, rather than questioning the methods involved. This atmosphere of trust made it easier for researchers to recruit participants and conduct studies involving complex behavioral situations. Understanding this broader context helps explain how the Milgram Obedience Experiments could take place within a respected academic setting. The combination of historical questions, evolving research culture, and institutional credibility created an environment where examining obedience to authority seemed both relevant and scientifically valuable. Stanley Milgram was a young social psychologist working at Yale University when he began developing the study that would later become widely known as the Obedience Experiments. Born in 1933 in New York City, Milgram grew up during a period shaped by global conflict and social transformation. His academic interests focused on how individuals behave within social systems, particularly how authority, conformity, and responsibility interact in complex situations. These themes would eventually form the foundation of his research proposal. Milgram's academic path included studies at Queens College and later at Harvard University, where he completed graduate work in social psychology. During his time at Harvard, he was influenced by earlier research on conformity, particularly experiments that demonstrated how individuals sometimes adjusted their behavior to align with group expectations. These findings raised broader questions about the strength of social influence and whether authority figures might exert even greater impact on behavior than peer pressure alone. The historical context of the period also played a significant role in shaping Milgram's thinking. Public discussions following the Second World War had included attempts to understand how individuals could participate in harmful actions under orders. Court proceedings and testimony revealed that many people claimed they were simply following instructions from authority figures. Milgram became interested in whether obedience might be studied experimentally in a controlled environment, allowing researchers to observe behavior directly, rather than relying solely on historical interpretation. His proposal involved examining how far individuals would go when instructed by an authority figure to perform actions that conflicted with their personal conscience. The idea was not to study cruelty itself, but rather the psychological tension created when obedience and morality appeared to conflict. Milgram believed that understanding this tension could provide insight into broader, positive questions about responsibility and authority in society. Designing the experiment required careful planning to create a believable situation. Participants needed to perceive the environment as legitimate and the instructions as credible. Milgram developed a scenario in which volunteers would believe they were assisting with a study on learning and memory. Within this framework, participants would be asked to administer what they believed were electric shocks to another person under the guidance of an experimenter. The shocks were not real, but the participants were not aware of that fact during the sessions. The experimental setup aimed to observe behavioral responses, rather than attitudes alone. Milgram wanted to see whether participants would continue following instructions when the situation became uncomfortable or morally challenging. By structuring the experiment with gradual escalation, he hoped to identify points where individuals might choose to stop obeying authority. The design allowed for measurable outcomes, making it possible to analyze patterns across multiple participants. Institutional approval processes during that era were less formalized than modern research standards, but the study was conducted within the context of a respected academic institution. The laboratory setting, professional equipment, and authoritative presence of the experimenter all contributed to the credibility participants experienced. Milgram recognized that institutional legitimacy would play a role in how volunteers perceived the situation and responded to instructions. Recruitment plans involved advertising for volunteers from the local community, rather than limiting participation to students. This approach allowed Milgram to examine behavior among individuals from diverse backgrounds, strengthening the relevance of the findings. Participants were offered modest financial compensation for their time, which was typical for psychological research participation during that period. Milgram anticipated that many participants would refuse to continue once the instructions conflicted strongly with their sense of responsibility. The results would later prove more complex than expected, but at the proposal stage, the primary goal was to explore obedience within a controlled environment. The study sought to illuminate how authority influences behavior, not by examining extreme individuals, but by observing ordinary people placed within a structured situation. The proposal therefore combined historical curiosity, psychological theory, and experimental design into a single research project. Milgram's intention was to answer questions about human behavior that were both scientifically and socially significant. Within the academic environment of the early 1960s, this approach appeared innovative and relevant, setting the stage for experiments that would become some of the most discussed in the history of psychology. To begin the study, Stanley Milgram and his research team needed participants who represented ordinary members of the public rather than a narrow academic population. Recruitment took place through newspaper advertisements and mailed notices in the New Haven area, inviting adult men to participate in what was described as a study on learning and memory at Yale University. The wording of the advertisement was intentionally neutral, offering limited detail about the procedures, while emphasizing the legitimacy of the institution and the scientific purpose of the research. Volunteers who responded came from a wide range of occupations and educational backgrounds. They included factory workers, clerks, salesmen, engineers, and professionals, reflecting the diversity of the local community. This variation was important because Milgram wanted to examine obedience across ordinary social groups rather than focusing on individuals with specialized training or psychological knowledge. Participants were typically between 20 and 50 years old, though ages varied somewhat across sessions. Each volunteer was offered modest financial compensation for participating. The payment was provided regardless of whether they completed the experiment, which meant participants did not feel financial pressure to continue once the session began. This arrangement also reinforced the perception that they were contributing to legitimate research rather than performing a task for reward alone. For many participants, the opportunity to assist with scientific work at a respected university carried its own appeal. Screening procedures were relatively simple by modern standards. Participants were not subjected to extensive psychological evaluation before the experiment. Instead, basic information was collected to ensure they met the general requirements for participation, such as age and availability. The absence of detailed screening reflected the research norms of the period, when psychological experiments often relied on volunteers without extensive pre-assessment. The goal was to recruit individuals who represented typical members of society, rather than a carefully filtered group. When participants arrived at the laboratory, they encountered an environment designed to reinforce credibility and professionalism. The setting included equipment, paperwork, and an experimenter wearing attire associated with scientific authority. Another individual, who was actually part of the research team, was introduced as a fellow participant. This person would later play the role of the learner in the experimental procedure. The presence of another volunteer helped create the impression that the situation was authentic and that roles were assigned randomly. The initial interaction involved explaining that the study concerned the effects of punishment on learning. Participants were told that one person would act as the teacher and the other as the learner, with roles determined by drawing slips of paper. In reality, the drawing was arranged so that the real volunteer always became the teacher. This structure was intended to maintain the experimental design while preserving the appearance of fairness and randomness. Before the session began, participants were given instructions about the equipment they would use and the tasks they would perform. They were also introduced to the learner, who was seated in another room and connected to what appeared to be electrical apparatus. The setup was intended to appear convincing, allowing participants to believe that the situation was real. This perception of authenticity was essential for observing genuine behavioral responses during the experiment. Participants were not fully informed about the true purpose of the study at this stage. Instead, they believed they were assisting with research on memory and learning processes. The use of incomplete information, often referred to as deception in research contexts, was more common during this era than it would become later. Researchers believed that providing full details in advance might influence behavior and compromise the validity of results. This approach would later become one of the most debated aspects of the Milgram experiments. As recruitment and initial preparation concluded, participants entered the experimental phase with expectations shaped by trust in the institution and the authority of the experimenter. They were ordinary individuals, placed in an unfamiliar but credible environment, ready to follow instructions within what they believed was a legitimate scientific study. This combination of factors created the conditions necessary for observing how people respond when authority and personal judgment begin to interact in complex ways. The laboratory at Yale University, where the experiments took place, was designed to appear orderly, professional, and credible. Participants entered a setting that reflected the authority associated with academic research institutions. The rooms were arranged with equipment, chairs, control panels, and documentation materials that suggested technical precision. This physical environment played an important role in shaping participant perception, reinforcing the belief that they were taking part in a legitimate scientific procedure. Upon arrival, the volunteer was introduced to the experimenter, who wore a grey lab coat and spoke with calm confidence. The experimenter's manner was formal, yet composed, conveying authority without overt pressure. Another individual, presented as a fellow volunteer, was also present. This person was actually part of the research team and would later act as the learner. The introduction created a social context in which the participant believed roles were being assigned fairly between two volunteers. The next stage involved explaining the purpose of the study. Participants were told that the experiment aimed to examine the effects of punishment on learning and memory. The explanation appeared reasonable and consistent with psychological research of the time. Volunteers were informed that one person would act as the teacher, responsible for administering tasks and consequences, while the other would serve as the learner, attempting to recall information correctly. This framing established a structure of responsibility that participants accepted as part of the experimental process. Role assignment was conducted through what appeared to be a random selection process, using slips of paper. In reality, the outcome was predetermined, so that the real participant always became the teacher. The learner, who was part of the research team, then moved into a separate room where equipment was prepared. Participants observed the learner being seated and connected to what appeared to be electrical apparatus, including electrodes attached to the arm. The demonstration was intended to appear convincing, reinforcing the belief that the procedure involved genuine physical consequences. Before the experiment began, the participant was shown the control panel they would operate. This panel included switches labeled with increasing voltage levels, accompanied by descriptive terms indicating the intensity of the shocks. The design created a visual representation of escalation, making it possible to observe how participants responded as instructions progressed. To further enhance credibility, participants were given a sample shock at a low level so they could experience a mild sensation, reinforcing the impression that the equipment was functional. Once the learner was positioned in the adjacent room, communication occurred through audio connection, allowing the participant to hear responses without seeing the individual directly. The teacher was instructed to read word pairs and administer a shock whenever the learner answered incorrectly. After each error, the participant was told to increase the voltage according to the sequence on the control panel. The procedure was presented as structured and systematic, emphasizing the role of the participant as an assistant in the research process. As the session progressed, the learner's responses included expressions of discomfort and requests to stop, delivered according to a predetermined script. The participant, however, remained under the guidance of the experimenter, who provided standardized prompts encouraging continuation when hesitation occurred. These prompts were delivered calmly, without raised voice or overt threats, maintaining the impression that proceeding was expected within the scientific context. The separation between participant and learner contributed to the psychological dynamics of the experiment. Without direct visual contact, participants relied on auditory cues and the authority of the experimenter to interpret the situation. This arrangement created conditions where responsibility felt shared or transferred, a factor Milgram believed was central to understanding obedience. The environment was therefore carefully structured to observe how individuals navigated tension between instructions and personal judgment. Throughout the session, the laboratory setting remained consistent and controlled. The experimenter maintained a composed presence, reinforcing authority while avoiding emotional engagement. Participants were left to make decisions within a framework that appeared legitimate and professionally managed. This combination of environment, equipment, and social roles created the conditions necessary for observing behavioral responses that would later become central to the study's conclusions. When the first experimental sessions began, participants approached the task with the expectation that they were assisting with a legitimate study on learning. The initial stages of the procedure appeared straightforward. The teacher read word pairs aloud, and the learner responded according to instructions. When incorrect answers occurred, participants followed the experimenter's guidance and administered the first levels of what they believed were electrical shocks. At this early point, reactions were generally calm, as the voltage levels were described as mild, and the situation still felt manageable. As the sessions progressed, and the learners' scripted responses began to include expressions of discomfort, participants often showed signs of hesitation. Many looked toward the experimenter for reassurance or clarification, seeking confirmation that continuing was appropriate. The presence of the authority figure played a significant role during these moments. When the experimenter responded with calm prompts indicating that the procedure should continue, many participants resumed the task, even if uncertainty remained. Emotional reactions varied among individuals. Some participants expressed concern verbally, questioning whether the learner might be experiencing harm. Others displayed nervous laughter, shifting posture, or physical tension, suggesting internal conflict. These behaviors reflected the psychological pressure created by the situation, where instructions from authority appeared to conflict with personal empathy for another person. Observers recorded these reactions carefully, noting changes in tone, hesitation, and body language. For some participants, the decision to continue appeared influenced by their interpretation of responsibility. They often assumed that the experimenter, as the professional authority, held responsibility for any consequences. This perception allowed them to proceed despite discomfort, believing they were fulfilling a role within a scientific framework. The institutional setting and structured instructions reinforced this interpretation, shaping how participants understood their own actions. Not all participants responded in the same way. Some individuals chose to stop the experiment when they felt the situation had become unacceptable. These participants expressed refusal directly, stating they would not continue administering shocks regardless of the experimenter's prompts. Their decisions highlighted variability in responses to authority, demonstrating that obedience was not universal. Milgram was interested in both those who continued and those who refused, as each response provided insight into behavioral patterns. Observers also noted that many participants experienced visible stress while continuing the procedure. Signs included perspiration, trembling hands, and strained speech. These reactions suggested that obedience did not necessarily indicate comfort or agreement with the instructions. Instead, individuals often continued while experiencing internal conflict, illustrating the tension between external authority and personal conscience. This distinction became an important part of interpreting the results. The early sessions revealed patterns that were more complex than Milgram initially expected. While he had anticipated that many participants would refuse to continue once discomfort became clear, a significant number proceeded further than predicted. This outcome suggested that situational factors, such as authority, presence, and structured roles, could exert powerful influence on behavior. The findings raised questions about how ordinary individuals respond under conditions of perceived obligation. Participants frequently sought reassurance from the experimenter during moments of hesitation. The standardized prompts were designed to encourage continuation, without overt coercion. Statements emphasized the importance of completing the experiment and reassured participants that responsibility rested with the researcher. These prompts often reduced hesitation enough for participants to proceed, demonstrating how subtle forms of authority communication can influence decisions. After sessions concluded, participants were informed that the shocks were not real and that the learner had not been harmed. Many expressed relief upon learning this information, and some reported surprise at their own behavior during the experiment. The debriefing process allowed researchers to observe how individuals interpreted their actions once the true nature of the situation was revealed. These reflections contributed to understanding how people reconcile behavior with self-perception. The early sessions, therefore, provided valuable observations about human behavior under structured authority. Participants were not extreme individuals, but ordinary volunteers responding to an unfamiliar situation shaped by institutional credibility and guidance. Their reactions, ranging from obedience to refusal, revealed the complexity of decision-making when authority and empathy intersect. These observations formed the foundation for further analysis as the study continued. As the experiment continued beyond the early stages, the structure of the procedure created a gradual escalation that increased psychological pressure on participants. Each incorrect response from the learner required the teacher to move to the next voltage level on the control panel. Because the increases occurred in small steps, participants were not confronted with a sudden decision, but rather a sequence of choices that built upon previous actions. This gradual progression made it more difficult for individuals to identify a clear point at which they should refuse to continue. The role of the experimenter became increasingly important during this phase. When participants hesitated, expressed concern, or questioned whether they should proceed, the experimenter delivered standardized prompts. These prompts were calm and measured, emphasizing that the procedure required continuation and that responsibility for the outcome rested with the research authority. The tone remained professional rather than forceful, which often reinforced the perception that continuing was expected within the context of the study. Participants frequently displayed signs of internal conflict as the learner's scripted responses intensified. Expressions of discomfort, requests to stop, and apparent distress from the adjacent room created emotional tension for the teacher. Many participants paused, looked toward the experimenter, or verbally expressed doubt about proceeding. The psychological pressure emerged from the conflict between empathy for the learner and the perceived obligation to follow instructions from an authority figure associated with a respected institution. Some individuals attempted to negotiate with the experimenter, suggesting alternatives such as checking on the learner or ending the session early. These moments revealed how participants sought ways to resolve the tension without directly refusing authority. When the experimenter responded with reassurance or repeated prompts, many participants resumed the procedure, demonstrating how authority presence could influence decision-making even when discomfort was apparent. The concept of responsibility transfer played a significant role in participant behavior, because the experimenter explicitly stated that he would take responsibility for the consequences. Some participants appeared to interpret their role as following instructions rather than making independent moral decisions. This perception allowed them to continue despite emotional discomfort, illustrating how authority structures can reshape individuals' sense of accountability within a situation. Physical and emotional reactions often intensified during this stage. Observers recorded signs such as nervous laughter, trembling hands, perspiration, and strained speech patterns. These indicated that participants were experiencing stress rather than acting with indifference. The continuation of the procedure under these conditions suggested that obedience did not necessarily reflect agreement with the actions being taken, but rather the influence of situational factors that shaped behavior. Not all participants continued to the highest levels of the procedure. Some individuals refused to proceed, stating clearly that they would not administer further shocks. These refusals sometimes occurred after repeated prompts from the experimenter, showing that personal limits could override authority influence in certain cases. The presence of both obedience and refusal within the same experimental framework provided valuable comparative data for understanding behavioral variation. The escalation also revealed how situational framing affected perception. Participants often focused on the immediate instruction rather than the broader implications of the task, because each step followed logically from the previous one. The overall trajectory toward higher voltage levels could feel less abrupt than it appeared when viewed afterward. This phenomenon illustrated how incremental changes can influence decision-making without individuals fully recognizing the cumulative effect. For many participants, the authority of the experimenter remained central throughout the session. The combination of institutional credibility, professional appearance, and confident instruction created a powerful context that shaped behavior. Participants frequently deferred to this authority, even while expressing discomfort, highlighting the complexity of human responses within structured environments. The escalation of authority and psychological pressure therefore demonstrated how ordinary individuals navigate situations where instructions conflict with personal judgment. The experiment revealed that behavior can be influenced not only by individual personality, but also by context, authority, presence, and gradual progression. These observations would later contribute to broader discussions about obedience, responsibility, and the conditions under which people choose to comply or resist. As the experiments continued and data accumulated, questions about the ethical implications of the study began to emerge. Although the procedures had been designed to examine obedience under controlled conditions, the emotional reactions observed in participants prompted reflection on whether the psychological stress involved was justified. Some participants displayed visible distress during sessions, including anxiety, hesitation, and strong emotional responses. While they were later informed that no real harm had occurred, the experience itself raised concerns about the impact of the situation on their well-being. At the time the experiments were conducted, formal ethical oversight structures were not as developed. Institutional review boards and detailed participant protection guidelines were still evolving within academic research. As a result, decisions about acceptable risk were often left to researchers themselves, guided by professional judgment rather than external regulation. This context allowed studies like Milgram's to proceed under standards that would later be examined more critically. Within the research team, there was awareness that the procedure created significant psychological tension. The experimental design relied on participants believing that they might be causing discomfort to another person, which was central to studying obedience. However, this same element also produced emotional strain. The balance between scientific value and participant experience became an important question, both during the study and afterward when results were discussed more widely. Debriefing procedures were implemented to address potential harm. After each session, participants were informed that the shocks were not real and that the learner had not been injured. The true purpose of the experiment was explained, and participants were given the opportunity to ask questions and express reactions. Many individuals reported relief upon learning the reality of the situation, and follow-up communication was conducted to assess whether any lasting distress remained. Milgram later reported that most participants indicated they were glad to have participated, although debate about these conclusions continued among scholars. Public and academic attention intensified ethical discussion once the findings became known. Critics argued that participants had been subjected to unnecessary stress and that deception had been used without sufficient justification. Supporters countered that the knowledge gained about obedience and authority had significant social importance. This disagreement reflected broader questions about the responsibilities of researchers when studying human behavior, particularly when emotional impact is involved. The experiments themselves did not end abruptly due to a single event, but concluded after sufficient data had been collected across multiple sessions and variations of the procedure. Researchers analyzed participant behavior, comparing outcomes across different experimental conditions to understand how factors such as authority, presence, and proximity influenced obedience. By the time the study ended, a substantial body of information had been gathered that would later be published and discussed extensively. The ethical debate that followed became one of the most influential aspects of the Milgram experiments. Discussions extended beyond the specific study to broader questions about how psychological research should be conducted. Concerns about informed consent, participant protection, and oversight mechanisms gained prominence within academic communities. These conversations contributed to changes that would shape research ethics policies in later decades. For Milgram himself, the study represented both a scientific achievement and a source of controversy. He defended the research as necessary for understanding human behavior under authority, while acknowledging that the procedures involved emotional tension. The debates surrounding his work demonstrated how scientific inquiry can intersect with ethical responsibility, creating complex questions that extend beyond experimental results. Ultimately, the ethical concerns associated with the study played a role in shaping how psychological research would evolve. The termination of the experiments marked not only the conclusion of data collection, but also the beginning of a long conversation about the responsibilities of researchers toward participants. This dialogue would influence policies, oversight systems, and professional standards, ensuring that future studies would be conducted under clearer ethical frameworks than those that existed during the early 1960s. When the results of the Milgram Obedience Experiments were first presented within academic circles, they immediately attracted attention and discussion. Psychologists recognized that the findings touched on fundamental questions about human behavior, authority, and moral decision-making. At the same time, the methods used in the study raised concerns about participant experience and the role of deception in research. This combination of scientific interest and ethical debate ensured that the experiments would receive significant scrutiny from universities and professional organizations. Academic review focused on several key areas. Researchers examined the experimental design, the validity of the findings, and the interpretation of participant behavior. Many scholars agreed that the study demonstrated the powerful influence of situational factors on obedience. The structured environment, authority, presence, and incremental escalation appeared to produce measurable behavioral patterns that could not be easily explained by personality traits alone. This perspective contributed to the study's recognition as an important contribution to social psychology. However, ethical questions remained central to institutional response. Some academics argued that the emotional stress experienced by participants exceeded acceptable limits, particularly because individuals believed they might be causing harm to another person. Concerns were also raised about whether participants had provided truly informed consent, given that they were not told the full purpose of the study in advance. These issues prompted discussions about how research involving human subjects should be evaluated and regulated. Universities and professional organizations began reflecting more broadly on research oversight. At the time, formal ethical review committees were not consistently established across institutions. The controversy surrounding studies like Milgram's contributed to growing recognition that independent evaluation processes were necessary. Over the following years, academic institutions increasingly adopted review boards responsible for assessing research proposals before experiments involving human participants could proceed. Institutional response also involved consideration of participant follow-up and well-being. Milgram's reports indicated that many participants did not experience long-term harm and often expressed satisfaction with having contributed to scientific knowledge. Nevertheless, critics questioned whether self-reported reassurance was sufficient to address ethical concerns. This debate highlighted the difficulty of evaluating psychological impact, especially when participants might interpret their experiences differently over time. Professional organizations within psychology engaged in discussions about ethical guidelines, seeking to define clearer standards for future research. These conversations addressed issues such as deception, participant stress, voluntary withdrawal, and debriefing procedures. Over time, ethical codes became more detailed, reflecting lessons learned from earlier studies. The Milgram experiments therefore played a role in shaping the evolution of professional standards within the discipline. Despite criticism, many academics continued to regard the study as scientifically significant. Replications and variations conducted by other researchers produced similar patterns of behavior, reinforcing confidence in the general conclusions about obedience to authority. The combination of controversial methods and influential findings created a complex legacy, where the study was both challenged and respected within academic discourse. Institutional response also included consideration of how research results should be communicated to the public. Because the findings touched on sensitive topics related to morality and behaviour, universities and researchers recognized the importance of careful explanation. Academic publications presented data and interpretation within professional frameworks, while later discussions addressed ethical implications more directly. This dual focus reflected the responsibility institutions felt toward both scientific advancement and societal understanding. For Yale University and the broader academic community, the Milgram experiments became a reference point for conversations about research responsibility. The study demonstrated how powerful findings can emerge from controlled experiments while simultaneously raising questions about participant protection. Institutions responded by strengthening oversight mechanisms and encouraging ongoing dialogue about ethical practice. In the years that followed, the academic review of the Milgram experiments remained active. Scholars revisited the data, debated interpretations, and examined methodological details. This continuing analysis reflected the study's enduring importance, not only for understanding obedience, but also for shaping how research involving human participants is conducted. The institutional response, therefore, extended far beyond the original experiments, influencing the direction of psychological research for generations. As the findings of the Milgram Obedience Experiments moved beyond academic journals, they began to attract attention from the wider public. Media outlets reported on the study in newspapers, magazines, and television programs, often highlighting the surprising observation that ordinary individuals could follow authoritative instructions, even when those instructions appeared to conflict with personal conscience. The topic resonated with audiences because it touched on fundamental questions about morality, responsibility, and human nature. The way the experiments were presented in the media varied depending on the outlet. Some reports focused on the scientific significance of the research, explaining how situational factors could influence behavior. Others emphasized the dramatic aspects of participant reactions, describing moments of hesitation or distress. This diversity in coverage contributed to both curiosity and controversy, as audiences encountered different interpretations of what the experiments revealed about human behavior. Public discussion often extended beyond the specific details of the study to broader social concerns. Many people wondered how they themselves might respond in similar circumstances. The idea that obedience could override personal judgment prompted reflection about authority in everyday life, from workplace hierarchies to institutional structures. These conversations demonstrated how psychological research can influence public thinking when findings connect to universal human experiences. Television programs and documentaries further expanded awareness by presenting visual representations of the experimental setup and participant behavior. Seeing individuals respond to instructions within a laboratory environment made the concepts more tangible for audiences. These portrayals helped people understand the psychological dynamics involved, while also raising ethical questions about the methods used. Visual media, therefore, played a significant role in shaping public perception of the experiments. Media attention also contributed to debate about research ethics. Journalists and commentators discussed whether participants had been treated fairly, and whether deception was justified in the pursuit of knowledge. Some articles expressed concern about the emotional stress involved, while others defended the study as an important contribution to understanding human behavior. This public debate mirrored discussions occurring within academic communities, extending the conversation into broader society. The experiments became part of cultural dialogue during a period when authority and social structures were being questioned more widely. The 1960s were marked by social movements, political change, and challenges to established institutions. In this context, research examining obedience to authority carried particular relevance, as people considered how individuals relate to power structures within society. The study, therefore, intersected with cultural themes already present during the era. Books and academic publications written by Stanley Milgram further increased public awareness. His explanations of the research process, participant reactions, and theoretical interpretation made the experiments accessible to readers outside psychology. These publications contributed to the lasting visibility of the study, ensuring that it remained part of public conversation long after the original experiments had ended. The accessibility of his writing helped bridge the gap between academic research and everyday understanding. Over time, references to the Milgram experiments appeared in discussions of education, leadership, and ethics. The findings were used to illustrate concepts related to authority, influence, and decision-making, sometimes extending beyond their original context. While such references increased awareness, they also occasionally simplified complex results into general statements about obedience. This tendency highlighted the challenge of communicating nuanced scientific findings to broad audiences. Public awareness also encouraged ongoing reflection about personal responsibility. People considered how individuals navigate situations where instructions from authority conflict with moral values. The experiments provided a framework for discussing these dilemmas, contributing to conversations about ethical decision-making in various fields. The impact extended beyond psychology, influencing perspectives in sociology, philosophy, and organizational studies. The media coverage and public response therefore transformed the Milgram experiments from a laboratory study into a widely recognized cultural reference. Awareness spread across generations, ensuring that the questions raised by the research continued to be discussed. The combination of scientific interest, ethical debate, and human relevance created a lasting presence in public consciousness, shaping how people think about authority and behavior even decades later. As the decades passed, the Milgram Obedience Experiments continued to attract attention, not only for their findings, but also for questions about their interpretation and methodology. Researchers revisited the original data, examining how conclusions had been drawn and whether alternative explanations might exist. This process of reassessment is common in scientific inquiry, where influential studies are repeatedly analyzed as new perspectives and methods emerge over time. One area of criticism focused on the role of participant belief. Some scholars questioned whether all participants truly believed the shocks were real throughout the experiment. If individuals suspected the situation was not genuine, their behavior might reflect compliance with perceived expectations rather than obedience to authority alone. Researchers examined transcripts, recordings, and participant reports to evaluate the extent of belief, leading to ongoing discussion about how perception influenced outcomes. Methodological concerns also became part of the debate. Critics explored whether the laboratory environment and artificial structure of the experiment accurately reflected real-world situations involving authority. While controlled conditions allow researchers to isolate variables, they can also create scenarios that differ from everyday experiences. Discussions therefore considered how broadly the findings could be applied beyond the experimental setting. Supporters argued that the core psychological mechanisms identified were relevant to many contexts, while critics emphasized the limits of generalization. Ethical analysis continued to evolve as research standards developed. Later generations of psychologists evaluated the study according to more detailed ethical frameworks than those available at the time. Questions about informed consent, deception, and participant stress were examined with increased scrutiny. While many acknowledged that ethical norms had changed significantly since the 1960s, the experiments remained a reference point in discussions about participant protection and researcher responsibility. Attempts to replicate or extend the findings contributed additional perspectives. Researchers conducted variations of obedience studies under modified conditions, sometimes incorporating stronger ethical safeguards or alternative procedures. These studies often produced results that supported the general conclusion that authority can influence behavior. although differences in design created variations in outcomes. Replication efforts, therefore, reinforced interest in the phenomenon, while highlighting the importance of context. Historical analysis also played a role in reassessment. Scholars examined Milgram's own writings, correspondence, and research notes to better understand his intentions and interpretations. This deeper examination provided insight into how the experiments were conceived and how results were framed within theoretical discussions. Such analysis contributed to a more nuanced understanding of the study's development and impact. Public and academic criticism sometimes focused on the way findings were communicated. Simplified summaries occasionally suggested that most people would obey authority without question, which did not fully capture the complexity of participant reactions observed. Many participants experienced hesitation, stress, or refusal, indicating variability in behavior rather than uniform obedience. Clarifying these nuances became part of later scholarly discussion, emphasizing that human responses to authority are influenced by multiple factors. The reassessment process also highlighted the historical context in which the experiments were conducted. Research culture, ethical standards, and societal concerns of the 1960s differed from those of later decades. Understanding this context helped scholars evaluate the study more accurately, recognizing both its contributions and its limitations. This perspective allowed for balanced discussion rather than purely critical or purely supportive interpretations. Despite ongoing criticism, the Milgram experiments remained influential. They continued to be taught in psychology courses, referenced in academic literature, and discussed in public forums. The combination of provocative findings and ethical debate ensured that interest did not fade over time. Instead, the study became an example of how scientific research can stimulate ongoing conversation long after initial publication. Later reassessment therefore contributed to a deeper understanding of both the experiments and their implications. By examining methodology, interpretation, and ethical considerations, scholars refined perspectives on what the study revealed about human behavior. The continuing dialogue demonstrated that influential research often evolves in meaning as new generations revisit it, ensuring that its impact extends far beyond its original context. Over the decades following the Milgram Obedience Experiments, the study came to occupy a significant place in both psychology and broader social understanding. Its influence extended beyond academic research, shaping conversations about authority, responsibility, and ethical decision-making across multiple fields. For psychologists, the experiments contributed to a deeper recognition of how situational factors can influence behavior, challenging assumptions that actions are determined solely by personality or individual character. One of the most direct impacts appeared in the development of research ethics. As debates about the Milgram study continued, universities and professional organizations strengthened standards for protecting participants in psychological experiments. Institutional review boards became more widely established, requiring researchers to submit proposals for ethical evaluation before conducting studies involving human subjects. Informed consent procedures, debriefing requirements, and participant safeguards were refined, in part because earlier research had revealed the need for clearer protections. The experiments also influenced theoretical approaches within social psychology. Researchers increasingly emphasized the interaction between individual behavior and environmental context, recognizing that authority structures, group dynamics, and situational pressures can shape decisions in powerful ways. This perspective contributed to later research on conformity, leadership, and organizational behavior, expanding understanding of how people respond within structured systems. Beyond academia, the findings entered public discourse and education. Discussions about obedience and authority appeared in classrooms, training programs, and professional settings, often used to illustrate how individuals navigate ethical dilemmas. The experiments encouraged reflection on personal responsibility, prompting individuals to consider how they might respond when faced with instructions that conflict with moral judgment. This introspective element helped maintain the study's relevance across generations. In organizational contexts, the research influenced thinking about leadership and authority relationships. Employers, educators, and policymakers examined how hierarchical structures affect decision-making and accountability. Awareness that individuals may defer to authority under certain conditions encouraged development of policies that emphasize ethical responsibility and the importance of questioning harmful instructions. The experiments therefore contributed indirectly to discussions about workplace ethics and professional conduct. The study also intersected with historical reflection. Observers considered how understanding obedience could shed light on events in which individuals followed orders with harmful consequences. While laboratory experiments cannot fully replicate complex historical situations, the research provided a framework for exploring how authority and responsibility interact. This connection between psychology and history contributed to interdisciplinary discussions involving sociology, philosophy, and ethics. Popular culture incorporated references to the Milgram experiments as well. Films, literature, and public commentary occasionally drew upon the concept of obedience to authority, using it to explore moral conflict and human behavior. These references reinforced public familiarity with the study, ensuring that its themes remained visible even outside academic environments. The experiments became part of a broader cultural vocabulary about authority and decision-making. Educational institutions often use the study as a teaching tool to demonstrate both psychological principles and ethical considerations in research. Students learning about social psychology encountered the experiments as an example of how behavior can be influenced by context, while also examining debates about participant protection. This dual role as both scientific finding and ethical case study contributed to the enduring importance of the research in academic education. Over time, the Milgram experiments came to represent a broader lesson about human behavior. They suggested that individuals are capable of actions they might not predict when placed within structured authority systems. At the same time, the variability in participant responses showed that refusal and moral resistance are also part of human behavior. This balanced perspective helped prevent overly simplified conclusions, encouraging more nuanced understanding. The long-term impact on society, therefore, involved both awareness and reflection. The study encouraged people to consider how authority influences decisions, how responsibility is interpreted, and how ethical choices are made under pressure. Its legacy remains visible in research practices, educational discussions, and cultural conversations. Even decades after the original experiments, the questions raised continue to resonate, illustrating how a single study can shape understanding across disciplines and generations. As this story settles into the quiet of the night, what remains most striking is not a single moment or outcome, but a question that continues to linger. How do ordinary people respond when placed in situations shaped by authority, expectation, and uncertainty? The laboratory environment where the experiments took place was calm and controlled. Yet within that setting, participants encountered internal conflict that revealed something deeply human about decision-making. Their reactions were varied, complex, and shaped by circumstances that many had never imagined facing. The passage of time has allowed these events to move from immediate experience into reflection. The volunteers who participated returned to their daily lives, and the academic discussions evolved across decades. What remains is the broader understanding that behavior is often influenced by context in ways we may not fully recognize while living through a moment. Authority, responsibility, and personal judgment can interact in subtle ways, creating situations where choices feel less clear than we might expect. There is also a sense of quiet reassurance in recognizing that human behavior is not defined by a single pattern. Some participants continued following instructions, while others chose to stop when discomfort reached a certain point. This variation reflects the complexity of individual decision-making, shaped by personality, perception, and circumstance. It reminds us that responses to authority are not predetermined, but influenced by multiple factors that unfold within each situation. As you rest, there is no need to analyze or draw conclusions. The details of the study can now fade gently into the background, becoming part of a larger reflection on human experience. The night is calm, steady, and still, offering space for the mind to slow and release its focus. The questions raised by the story belong to another time, carried forward only through thought and memory. Allow the atmosphere to soften now. The sounds of the day have quieted, and there is nothing required except rest. Breathing becomes slower, thoughts become lighter, and the steady rhythm of night continues without urgency. The story settles into silence, where reflection remains peaceful, and the mind can drift naturally towards sleep as the night deepens.